Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor of Shadowproof, and I'm pleased to be with you for another edition of the Dissenter Weekly. It's June 10, 2021. And before we get rolling, I'm joined by my colleague, Brian, who has some things for you for this week.
Hi, everyone. Before we get started, just wanted to remind you to make sure you're following, if you're not already, wherever you're watching. And also to remind you that we are a 100% reader-supported news outlet. So if you want to support the work that Kevin does, if you want to help fund freelance reporting, if you want to make sure that Shadowproof can pay its bills now into the future, you can go to shadowproof.com/donate and chip in there, or you can subscribe to Kevin's newsletter, which we will discuss towards the end of today's show. Kevin, why don't you kick us off here with our first story? We have the Supreme Court limits how prosecutors may use computer fraud law against whistleblowers.
So it's a good news story. I think this is something that in my coverage of Chelsea Manning, this popped up. The whole idea of, did you really exceed your authorized access when you already had access to that computer? You had access to those databases. You were able to look at those files. So you couldn't have been committing a crime. Maybe you weren't supposed to, under the statutes or the guidelines for that agency, take those files and do what you did with those files. But you were certainly allowed to be in there. You had authorized access. And yet prosecutors have used the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and as the Supreme Court says in a 6-3 decision, abused the nature of this law. And so what happened is, I'm just going to read this full introduction to the decision that came from the Supreme Court, so everyone knows how it got to this outcome. The former Georgia Police Sergeant Nathan Van Buren used his patrol car computer to access a law enforcement database to retrieve information about a particular license plate number in exchange for money, so that's a crime. Although Van Buren used his own valid credentials to perform the search, his conduct violated a department policy against obtaining database information for non-law enforcement purposes. Unbeknownst to Van Buren, his actions were part of a FBI sting operation. Van Buren was charged with a felony violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which subjects to criminal liability anyone who, quote, intentionally accesses a computer without authorization or exceeds authorized access. The term exceeds authorized access is defined to mean to access a computer with authorization and to use such access to obtain or alter information in the computer that the accessor is not entitled so to obtain or alter. A jury convicted Van Buren, and the district court sentenced him to 18 months in prison. Van Buren appealed to the 11th Circuit, arguing that the exceeds authorized access clause applies only to those who obtain information to which their computer access does not extend, not to those who misuse access that they otherwise have. In other words, it was supposed to cover things like hacking, getting into files, folders, or databases when you weren't supposed to be in them in the first place. Or, if it was someone who was a cyber criminal, it was supposed to be for that. But it's been used in the last 10 or 15 years as this additional charge that comes with people who release documents to the media, reveal information often in the public interest. And I'll just note that there's a section at the end of the decision, which in the summary, I'm reading from the summary of the Supreme Court's decision, where it says the government's interpretation of the exceeds authorized access clause would attach criminal penalties to a breathtaking amount of commonplace computer activity. For instance, employers commonly state that computers and electronic devices can be used only for business purposes. On the government's reading, an employee who sends a personal email or reads the news using a work computer has violated the CFAA. The government speculates that other provisions might limit its prosecutorial power, but its charging practice and policy indicate otherwise. The government's approach would also inject arbitrariness into the assessment of criminal liability, because whether conduct like Van Buren's violated the CFAA would depend on how an employer phrased the policy that was violated. So In other words, it means that a whole array of conduct that is common could be criminalized through the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So this is when you look at organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, and others have challenged the CFAA for a long time. And now we have this ruling finally with the Supreme Court doing something that limits the broadness of how prosecutors have applied this. And again, I mentioned that it's surfaced in typical whistleblower cases. So finally, I'll conclude this on this story. And I think this is a really huge development. So Stephen Cohn at the National Whistleblower Center said in a statement that this was critically important because whistleblowers often access computer information and provide it to law enforcement officials, even if those disclosures were not authorized by the company. And that makes sense. They're not authorized by the Pentagon if you're a military whistleblower, not authorized by the Treasury Department, you're not authorized by Bank of America or Credit Suisse if you're a bank whistleblower. And so consequently, this broad reading of the CFAA criminalizes or could be used to criminalize typical whistleblower behaviors. So if you're not going through channels within the agency, but you're still revealing conduct that is criminal, you should be able to do so without running afoul of the statute. And that's definitely not the way Congress intended it to be used. So something positive coming out of the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Kevin. Love when we have good news to share on the show and elsewhere at Shadowproof. Let's move on to our next story here. We have the FinCEN files. Whistleblower has been sentenced to 6 months in prison. Why don't you bring us up to speed on this story?
So this involves Natalie Mayflower Sowers Edwards. She was a senior official in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network section of the Treasury Department. She's been sentenced to 6 months in federal prison, which is an extraordinary amount of time. This is on the high range of what the probation office was willing to allow, what sentencing guidelines allow. The probation office actually said that she should be sentenced to 2 years of probation. Recommended mental health treatment and years of probation. Did not recommend prison time. And the government said that there needed to be an extraordinary sentence issued against her on the high range of what sentencing guidelines would allow, simply to make an example out of her. In fact, they got a submission or a statement from a senior Treasury Department official from this FinCEN division that said as much, that because she disclosed tens of thousands of files, there needed to be a message sent to other people within the department that this could happen to you if you give a reporter confidential information about so these are suspicious activity reports about what is ongoing with transactions at banks. And so these typically banks, they could be more broadly financial institutions. And these files were given to BuzzFeed reporter Jason Leopold over it, and then shared with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and some other partners throughout the world. And as OCCRP points out, this is the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Her files fueled a series of journalistic publications that covered the role that banks play in allowing criminals to move, launder, and hide dirty money. So there was a public benefit to what she disclosed. There were also some files that were disclosed that provided details related to the Mueller investigation, and they were financial records that were related to Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, and some of the alleged Russian figures that were being targeted in that investigation. So these form the basis of stories that had to do with much of what part of what the U.S. media was covering, but also this larger, more substantial issue of the way in which banks profit off of dirty money. And so now she's been sentenced to 6 months. They call it the unauthorized disclosure of suspicious activity reports. They elevate these documents to the level of classified information, even though they're not classified information. It's not a charge under the Espionage Act, but it's almost akin. They're so zealous in their urge to punish that they make it seem like she is aiding terrorists in the release of these files. And so this is something that is, I think we should be alarmed by, because of the fact it is an extreme sentence by the standards of the guidelines and by what the probation office recommended.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move over to the city of Eunice, Louisiana, where the ACLU is suing on behalf of a whistleblowing police officer. Talk to us about this story.
Yeah, so, and we've got a set of these police stories that we'll be going through. But for this particular one, this is a small town in Louisiana. It's in the central part of the state. It's about 10,000 people. And this lieutenant, he claims that there's excessive use of force, neglect of inmate medical needs going on. There's mishandling of evidence, and there's misuse of funds within the department. This is according to an ACLU of Louisiana press release. And importantly for our story, he says that despite notifying officials at all levels, state, local, and federal, he's not been able to make any headway in getting the department to address the alleged misconduct, that people are being protected from criminal charges within the department, and that the chief of police, Randy Fontenot, is protecting other officers. So you've got that kind of code within the police department of protecting people so that they can maintain a certain culture, which we've seen frequently in talking about these kinds of police whistleblower cases. And because he's the one that wants to change how the department operates, then he is facing punishment and retaliation himself. He claims that his hours and compensation were reduced, that there's been lies spread within the department about him, that he was accused, or falsely accused, I emphasize falsely accused, of enlisting an individual facing criminal charges to falsely claim that he himself bribed that criminal. So, arguing that he's engaged in some kind of conspiracy. Dunn is also been threatened with bodily harm, he says, and targeted with disciplinary action as like pretext to force him to resign from the department. So this is someone who's not a lowest level of the department, somebody who has some standing within the department to do this, and has decided that he's going to challenge some of the practices. And I just think, as these kinds of things happen, it's important to flag them. So we'll see where this goes and if he's able to win on any of these general claims. But here's another police whistleblower case.
Thank you. Our next policing story here is in Milwaukee, where Milwaukee police have no formal whistleblower protection. Why don't you explain this one to us?
Yeah, it seems a little baffling when you think about how many years we've been seeing these cases unfold. We've been following them closely. Police shootings, the lack of accountability for officers who murder and kill civilians within their cities, especially Black or brown citizens of those cities. And we know their names. We say their names out loud. There's been protests and uprisings. There's been task forces for accountability. You would think that these bigger cities, and Milwaukee has had its major cases that have made headlines. You would think that the department would have some kind of formal whistleblower protection policy for its officers, but a Wisconsin policy forum actually did a study of the Milwaukee Police Department. And in it, they called attention to the fact that the Milwaukee police do not have any formal whistleblower protections. It's not to say that they do not encourage people in their code of conduct to bring things to the attention of their superiors if they see anything wrong. They do, but there's just no guidelines there for how to do it. There's nothing there that would formally protect an officer who would take this risk. And as we just talked about what happened in the city of Eunice, even in a small town, that's what's happening. But in a bigger town, where the stakes are even higher, the budgets are much larger, more substantial, and you have people who have more authority and power in a bigger city. You can see what would happen if you challenge chiefs of police who do not want to be found out that they are corrupt or are involved in covering up crimes that have been committed by officers, especially if there are those that are on the take. Are they involved in any side hustles or whatever? Those are things that they would not want to be blown or exposed to the public. And so an officer likely would be in trouble having no formal whistleblower protection policy. In contrast, the Wisconsin Policy Forum points to Baltimore, pointing to their policy and the way that they have their whistleblower protections structured. And, also astoundingly, they do point out that Milwaukee's not actually the only city that is yet to establish a formal whistleblower protection policy. They say Minneapolis is still working on getting one in place. That's a little baffling, knowing that that's where George Floyd was murdered. We've got the fact that Kansas City is still working on establishing a whistleblower protection policy. So, it looks like something we may have taken for granted. Several of the larger cities in the United States do not have these formal whistleblower protection policies, which tells you just about everything you need to know about how interested police departments are in the United States in ensuring accountability. And in most of the times, they just use union contracts to prevent accountability from being established, from having larger mechanisms for that in cities.
Thank you for covering that, Kevin. Let's move over to the Pentagon, which is demanding that Congress help keep unclassified records secret. That doesn't sound right to me. Can you tell us a little bit about this one, Kev?
Yeah. I'm noticing that there's actually one more story I wanted to flag, but I didn't get the banner in there. So why don't you just take it down and I'll cover this. But it's something we've talked about before, and I wanted to make sure that I shared a quick update on this. So we've talked about this police whistleblower, Lorenzo Davis, who's in Chicago, where I am. And he was a supervising investigator at the city of Chicago's agency, which is tasked with police oversight. It's now called COPA. It was an independent police review board, basically, or IPRA. I think it was, an independent police review agency. So he was awarded $1.1 million by a Cook County jury recently. And this was in the face of an appellate court that had slashed his reward to $100,000 back in February. They took his $2 million award for emotional distress based upon his allegations. They took that down to $100,000 back in February. But this jury, and there were people who were initially involved in awarding that $2 million that were really irate at the actions of the appeals court. And so now they've gone back and they've given it. So now he's getting 50% of what he was originally promised. And so this is good news. He's generally pleased with the reversal of going back to this higher figure that recognizes what he's gone through as a whistleblower. And just to go back and quickly refresh your memory, this sort of thing was happening around the time that we were seeing stories develop around Chicago police corruption and the Laquan McDonald case, etc. And he was terminated. He was one of the few people at the agency that was resisting making requested changes that were directed by management in order to reflect certain findings that they wanted. In other words, as he said, they have. He was referring to Chicago police. They have shot people dead when they did not have to shoot. They were not in reasonable fear for their lives. The evidence shows that the officer knew or should have known that the person who they shot was not armed or did not pose a threat to them or could have been apprehended by means short of deadly force. So despite these cases where there was evidence that the shooting was not justified, he was facing this pressure to change the findings to show that the police officers had not done anything wrong. And eventually he was forced out of that agency or terminated. And now he's getting an award. We don't know if the city is going to appeal, but for the time, he's on the winning end of this. So some good news, some more good news.
Thanks. Do you want to go into that next story on the Pentagon?
Yes. So this is just breaking. This is just breaking as we do this show. I'll quickly sum it up by saying that the Pentagon is invoking national security and terrorism and all the things that we hear about and are familiar with, having covered the files that were disclosed by Chelsea Manning and files that have been published by WikiLeaks and covering this kind of journalism that exposes war crimes, covers torture, exposes the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, things of that nature. They want to be able to keep more files secret. In particular, they want to be able to keep unclassified records secret that they claim the Freedom of Information Act should not be able to be used in order for journalists or citizens to get these files disclosed. And an important figure, Patrick Leahy in Vermont, is upset and livid about this lobbying that continues from the Pentagon. So this isn't new. They've been trying to do this for several years. And he says, I've lost count how many times the Defense Department has come to Congress with this overbroad proposal to shield vast amounts of Pentagon information from public disclosure through the Freedom of Information Act. And so this is happening on Joe Biden's watch. Fortunately for us, we don't have the same kind of refrain in our ear that we had with Barack Obama's administration. We all recall, if you were around, that Obama held himself out early as the most transparent administration ever. And then repeatedly, you could document instances where he was undermining that pledge and promise. And Biden's not really doing that. He isn't committed to anything substantial when it comes to transparency. So there's really no risk to him if the Pentagon gets its way and can keep these records secret. I don't know if Congress is going to win, but it does seem fairly unreasonable what they're asking. These are unclassified records. So if they're sensitive materials, they should classify them. If they're unclassified, then they should be available to us.
Thanks, Kevin. The last story we have here on the list before we talk about the newsletter, which is relaunching, we have the Scottish High Court denies whistleblower Craig Murray's request to appeal his conviction. Why don't you walk us through this one?
Yeah, so first, a lot of gratitude to Muhammad Almazi for this guest contribution. We published this over at the Dissenter newsletter, which was relaunched this past week. And he followed up on his earlier report, which covered the political case against Craig Murray. And, if there are details about this that you don't understand, I encourage you to read that first report so that you can understand the issue. This is unfolding in the United Kingdom, but I do think that despite it being a UK case, it really does have a lot of bearing globally. And for Americans, I think it's something to follow in the United States, because he was convicted under the premise that he violated a law that is supposed to protect against jigsaw identification. He was covering a trial of former Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond, and he was convicted over these blog posts because it was said that the way that he covered it, people could have put the pieces together and identified accusers who suggested Salmond had engaged in misconduct. This was a sexual misconduct case. And in the end, Salmond was acquitted. There are political issues that swirl around the nature of that trial. There are political motivations that go into the fact that Craig Murray was charged. He is a former diplomat. He is someone widely recognized as a whistleblower and has been outspoken against the British or the United Kingdom government. He was in the Scottish High Court, and now he has an opportunity to appeal it to the UK Supreme Court, which he plans to do. But if he does not prevail, he will be sentenced to 8 months in prison, and that means he'll likely serve half of that. So for 4 months, he would be in prison. And it does raise significant press freedom issues because he was covering this trial. He was writing about it on his blog or his own personal website, and he does not have the kind of institutional support that people have at establishment media organizations. So for those who care about independent journalism, I mean, it is a hugely vulnerable position that he is in. And now with this case, it's putting everyone who covers sensitive trials, politically sensitive trials, in a position where they have to be extraordinarily careful about how they write about certain cases. And, if you do it the wrong way, if you get on the wrong side of power and you're effective, though, people are reading your work quite a lot, then they could potentially come down on you because of the fact that you could be accused of jigsaw identification. This is the kind of way that the NSA and others in the intelligence agencies talk about the impact of Edward Snowden's disclosures, saying things like that he is an NSA whistleblower, put out all of these different details about what goes on with the NSA's different programs and what they have as their capabilities for tracking alleged terrorists, and that those terrorist groups were then able to piece it together, and then they were able to hide their tracks from U.S. government agencies. And that's bogus and something that I reject as a reason why there shouldn't be transparency. And then in this case, again, this whole idea of jigsaw identification, this belief within agencies that this is what is going on, is now being used against Craig Murray in order to target journalism about a politically sensitive case. Again, I'm not familiar with the Scottish politics. I'm not familiar with Scottish and UK politics and what would be going on between these particular individuals. But I do know enough as someone who's a journalist to recognize that this is something that is criminalizing conduct that we want to be permissible in society and to not be targeted. So I thank Mohammed for covering this follow-up, and I presume that he'll probably have something for us, whether Craig Murray prevails or if he fails and eventually goes to prison. Perhaps he'll get a chance to talk to Craig Murray after all of this is over and get his take on what's happened with him. But this has set him back, and he's an older person, and it's disruptive to his life, which seems to be the intent for cases like this. Someone is pursuing this case because they don't want Craig Murray to be able to continue to do the work that he typically does with his personal blog.
Thanks, Kevin. And I think that is a good segue into the last thing that we wanted to touch on here before we close out. The Dissenter newsletter, relaunching at thedissenter.org. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about what's going on, what you have planned? And yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and so thanks for the few people out there who are tuning in live, and thanks to the people who are going to watch this video after it archives. And for those who have followed, we really barnstormed through a lot of stories. I feel like we made pretty good time, covered a lot in this edition of the Dissenter Weekly. I'm going to put together a post that goes out to members or subscribers of this Dissenter newsletter, and it'll have video. It'll also have links to all of the stories that we covered today, so you can do further reading if you'd like to get more detail about any of these specific stories. But I'm excited that we were able to relaunch the newsletter this past week. I did so with the first big thing that we published coming from a guest contributor. I really believe in expanding the Dissenter newsletter beyond myself and including Mohammed. And perhaps in a future Dissenter Weekly, we'll have Mohammed on to talk about some of the work that he's done. And he's also someone who's been covering the Julian Assange case, who I met when I was in the UK for one of the extradition hearings against Julian Assange back in February of 2020. And beyond that, we're going to be publishing a lot every week. There'll be 2 posts available to you if you are a member and signed up for free. And then there will be a couple more pieces of content, other posts available exclusively if you are a paid subscriber. And by being a paid subscriber, you're going to be funding this important journalism on whistleblowers. You'll be expanding the work that we can do to promote whistleblowing as a human right through this work, to give attention and go beyond partisan narratives about whistleblowing, and also to more closely cover these cases that often are ignored by most media outlets. You see local news reports out. You see these smaller outlets, state by state, city by city, cover these. They don't seem to typically make it into national news headlines, and that's what I'm trying to do is push some of this work out into the public, so that people know that this is happening. There are police whistleblowers. When there's environmental whistleblowers, an agency is challenging corruption at the Air Pollution Control Division, or there's solar panels that are catching fire at Tesla and a whistleblower was retaliated against and forced out. These kinds of stories, Amazon retaliation against people in the work who are whistleblowing against those conditions. We want those stories to be read by many and not just percolate beneath the surface. But that's going to take work. That takes ambition. That takes having more people who are sharing this newsletter and who are engaged with what we're doing and who are willing to fund and support this kind of work. We're going to seek submissions from people who are journalists and writers and have them publish guest contributions as part of the Dissenter, just like we do with Shadowproof, just like we're doing right now with the Marvel Cook Fellowship that Brian talks about and can talk more about if you'd like to remind you of it at the end of this broadcast. But yes, I'm excited and glad that we're up. It looks really good. I think there's a small glitch right now. The annual subscription option is not showing for people who want to upgrade, but you can still upgrade monthly. And as that's sorted out, you can become an annual paid subscriber. So if you want to wait for that, I totally understand. And, do let me know if you want to ping me on Twitter or whatever, if you're having an issue. I'll help work it out with you, and make sure that the fine people over at Ghost, which are hosting this site, fix it so that people can upgrade and support the Dissenter newsletter. So I thank everyone for all of their support, and everyone out there who believes in what we do. And I'll turn it over to Brian to conclude this broadcast.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm really excited for everything that's to come with the Dissenter. Definitely encourage folks to sign up and keep an eye on that. As you mentioned, we have more reporting coming from our fellowship on the abolition movement, some of which I've discussed on past episodes. I won't go into it now, but we're rounding out some edits on some drafts. So hopefully in the next week or two, I'll have some new stories to share with everybody. And yeah, thank you to everybody who donates out there. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I got one thing. First, just I see Tom Secker, our friend, tuned into the show. So I wanted to thank him over at Spy Culture, has contributed some fine work to Shadowproof. and he says he seconds the idea that Mo should be a guest. We don't usually have guests on this show; it's just us two. But we did have John Kiriakou on one time as a kind of guest host. But it would be nice to bring Mo on at 1 week just to talk, especially since he's the first contributor to the Dissenter newsletter. It would make sense. And then as the last thing I want to make sure I get in, I forgot. The Dissenter Weekly, we do this as a video. We post it as a video. We usually, the only way you can consume it is by watching this video. But as a paid subscriber, I'm working on developing or exporting the audio and uploading that as a podcast version, which would be available to people who are paid subscribers. So I would make that accessible to people who are willing to help fund this journalism. So the free people who do not support would, get the video. But if you wanted like a podcast that would be something you could listen to, then you'd have access to that if you were a paid subscriber.
Definitely. Yes. And perfect segue back into what I was saying, which is just a huge shout out and thank you to everybody who chips in now and then, even a couple dollars, people who give on a monthly basis, $5, $10, whatever, all of it really makes a big difference, and it adds up and it helps us keep things going and grow and do all these exciting things like launching this new Dissenter website. So really, really appreciate that support. Of course, a lot of people are, still going through hard times right now. And so we understand if you can't give, and that's why we encourage people who can give to step up so we can keep our reporting available to as many people as possible. And yeah, if you want to become a part of that and help us out, you can go to shadowproof.com/donate, see our donation and membership options there, as well as obviously signing up for Kevin's newsletter at thedissenter.org.
And sharing links is really great. If you don't have money, but you can let people who are in, even if it's a small social circle of family or friends, just sharing with 20 or 25 other people. That's really good. No guilt if you can't help us with money, but everyone can post a link to this on their own Facebook or share it on Twitter. And I think that goes a long way towards making sure people know that we're out there.
Yeah, definitely. And, if you're not too big on social media, talking up somebody, that might be interested in something that you read at Shadowproof, just letting people know we're out there.
Old school email.
That's right. We appreciate it. So with that said, Kevin, any final thoughts, or are you all good?
Nah, I'm all set. Thanks, Brian.
All right, cool. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and we'll catch you next week. Talk to you soon.